Hi, everyone. I think we should begin now. So firstly, I would like to take this opportunity to welcome everyone to the March edition of the Feminist Lunch series hosted by the Women, Gender and Sexuality Studies program at the University of Toronto, Mississauga. I'm going to read the land acknowledgement first before we offer some thanks to people who have made this event possible. WGSI, that is the Women and Gender Studies Institute, is situated in Toronto on Indigenous lands and shores of the planet's largest gathering of fresh water. WGSI recognizes the Indigenous land and more than human kin relations created within the knowledge systems of the Anishinaabeg peoples, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat and Petun peoples, including the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation and Six Nations of the Grand River. Toronto is now home to many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples, and is an important two-spirit, trans, and queer Indigenous gathering place. We activate the dish with one spoon, wampum belt covenant, the treaty that embodies our obligations of mutual care towards each other and the lands through commitments towards an ongoing consensual process of collective care and ethical relationality. This agreement was violated through the Toronto Purchase, and we live and work in relation to this violation, even as we strive to affirm its ethical invitation. WGSI invites its community to come into good relation with ongoing Indigenous governance, the land, the waters, and each other. Toronto is also a meeting place for many diasporic peoples and other indigenous nations from diverse lands who carry to WGSI their own knowledge systems, anti-colonial practices, and unique relations to this and other lands. First, I would like to thank the various people who have helped to make this event possible. Thanks goes to Victoria Tamasebi Begani, the Director of Women and Gender Studies, for her support. I also want to acknowledge the support of the Women and Gender Studies Institute at the University of Toronto, especially Alyssa Trotz and Joe Saliba. This event was made possible by funding from the University of Toronto Mississauga's Department of Historical Studies Undergraduate Experience Fund. Finally, shout out to I want to extend a shout out to my students in my diasporic sexualities class who are in attendance today. And in this class, we are currently reading and engaging Karma's book, Zom Femme. I'm going to offer a brief introduction before handing over to Karma. And the introduction is a little personal, but I think that given the kind of work and the kind of ways that we are imagining relationality, I think it's important to kind of map this very personal ways in which Karma's work has been so important to me and affecting me in very personal ways. So I first met Karma in early 2020 in downtown Toronto. Although I had seen Karma's work and had heard about them from mutual friends and acquaintances in Johannesburg, South Africa, this initial face-to-face meeting was significant for me. This was a meeting of two brown, queer, femboys whose lives and experiences were shaped by overlapping histories of indenture labor within the Indian Ocean. Karma grew up in Currapie, and I hope I'm saying that right, Karma, Mauritius, an Indian Ocean island, whilst I grew up in a small town called Tongaat, located within the sugarcane plantations alongside the Indian Ocean coast of South Africa. Indeed, the vast expanses of the Indian Ocean and the various forms of movement across that ocean connects us, positioning us as kin. Indeed, Karma's work in photography and performance art allowed me to, and I'm quoting here from Karma's inscription of my book, So indeed, Karma's work in photography and performance art allowed me to see glimpses of myself. When Karma signed Zomfam for me, they wrote, "This one is for us, queer children of indenture." Having migrated from Tongaat to Johannesburg to study, and then onwards and outwards to the United States and then to Canada, I often struggled for the language to describe and make sense of the historical experiences through which I am formed, the experiences of colonialism and indenture labor as it intersects with apartheid in South Africa, a system of racial segregation that officially ended only in 1994. These experiences have shaped and continue to shape my becoming, experiences that are often erased within hegemonic formations of nation and identity because they are not legible within state-sanctioned categories designed to capture, to curtail, to erase, and to render invisible. But as Karma so beautifully reminds us, the body remembers. When I first read Zomfam, I immediately recognized a language and an aesthetic of language that was uncannily familiar, that resonated, that gathered me, us, queer and queer children of indenture together within the same frame. Zomfam reorientated me to the past, one where histories of coerced labor like African slavery and Indian indentureship stick to each other in order to imagine a future to come, whereby recognizing the deep intimacies between us becomes the site to imagine our collective futures. Kama La Mackerel is a Montreal-based Mauritian Canadian multidisciplinary artist, educator, writer, community arts facilitator, and literary translator who works within and across performance, photography, installation, textile, digital art, and literature. Kama's work is grounded in the exploration of justice, love, healing, decoloniality, hybridity, cosmopolitanism, and self and collective empowerment. They believe that aesthetic practices have the power to build resilience and act as resistance to the status quo, thereby enacting an anti-colonial praxis through cultural production. Kama has exhibited and performed their work internationally, and their writing in English, French, and Creole has appeared in publications both online and print. Zomfam, their debut poetry collection published by Metonymy Press, was named a CBC Best Poetry Book and a Globe and Mail Best Debut Book, and was shortlisted for the QWF Concordia University First Book Award. I would now like to invite Kama, who will engage us in poetry and performance. And I'm going to hand over now to Kama. Thank you so much for making this possible. And I would also want to state that Kama is joining us from Mauritius. And I think it's so significant that we are able to engage in this dialogue across boundaries, across borders, and to recognize the very movements that are central to how we are constituted. Thank you, Kama.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for being here. Thank you, Jordash, for such a generous introduction. Yeah, I don't think I have. I'm really moved actually in the present moment by just how personal this introduction was more than anything. And I think one of the things that I think about is, yeah, the multiple ways in which, you know, we find kinship across oceans, across histories, the multiple ways in which we find queer kinship as well, and chosen families. And I think it's something for me that's been increasingly happening over the past few years, like just even thinking of like my own connection to South Africa, which is like through one of my like closest friends, one of my chosen family, and then, you know, and then how that circles back to Toronto and us meeting. So all of it is just like, just feels so meaningful. So thank you for this very generous introduction and very meaningful introduction. I come to you from Mauritius today, but when I am not, I'm here for a few months. Mauritius is home, but when I'm not in Mauritius, I am based on the traditional territories of the Ganyagehaga, also known as Montréal, known as Dejage in the Ganyagehaga language. And it's very important for me to start by, you know, acknowledging within that diasporic context and within that transnational, transoceanic context that we're in, to acknowledge the territories where I live and love, because those are the territories that nurture me. Those are the territories that give me the food that I eat, the oxygen that I breathe, the water that I drink. And there's a history to those territories. There's a really long history of genocide and displacement that are tied to those histories within Turtle Island, within Canada. And I think it's very important for every single one of us as settlers to actually situate ourselves and situate our responsibility to the traditional keepers of those territories. In particular, for those of us who are actually also, you know, like come from a legacy of displacement, whether it's through slavery or the indenture, right? Like we end up in those other colonized places, like in my case, Montreal, where the traditional people of those territories have also been displaced. And so I encourage everybody to also think of your own positionality depending on where you are in terms of that. So I'm going to be reading a couple of pieces from Zomfam, my debut poetry collection. And what I will do, so I'll read a couple of pieces. I will tell you a little bit about the history behind the work and the creative process and how this work unfolded and some of the questions that I was trying to explore for this work. And then Jordas will join me for a bit of a conversation, and then we'll open it out for a Q&A for to hear your own questions. So thank you everyone for being here. I also just want to take a moment to also just give props and acknowledgement to the students in particular who are joining us today. I'm not in school, but I have been doing a lot of online lectures, and I have a lot of friends who are either students or teachers. And I know it's been a struggle, and I know it's been those Zoom classes have been extremely challenging. I am sure for every single one of you. So I just want to acknowledge your resilience in terms of still pushing through, in terms of still showing up, however difficult this sort of like online teaching and learning is unfolding. And I also want to thank you for being here today and being part of that conversation, because I know I know how challenging it's been to have to be doing classes online in this way. So I will read a couple of pieces from Zomfam. I will start, the first piece that I will read is actually, so Zomfam is comprised of 8 pieces. They're long form poems. So there are only 8 poems in the book, and they're long form poems that kind of give the story of this gender creative child who comes from a family growing up on the plantation island of Mauritius within the legacy of slavery and the indenture. And throughout the story, it's a coming of age story where this child tries to find themselves, but also tries to find languages of love with which to communicate with their family and to be able to recognize that love in themselves, and then to be able to share that love with the family intergenerationally, in spite of the colonial silences and the taboos that are transmitted from generation to generation. So it starts with a piece which is the Invocation. It starts with a prayer. It's a very spiritual piece to me, this entire book. and also performance. I'll talk about this more. But then the first story is actually the story of the birth. So I'm going to get started today with the story of the birth. That's called Muffin from Zumfam. Ban la gi qui motine enzu kiti muffin enzu kiti soinet. The story goes that I was born on a day that was muffin. On that hot midsummer day, the southeast wind stopped blowing. The sun's burn stagnated high over the smothered flesh of the island. Heat rose from the ocean in sheets of vapor, distorting the island into dreamlike landscapes. On that day, the moon was plump and orange, high above the horizon, mirroring the sun against the skin of the sky. Geckos gathered on top of banana trees, licked their glazed burp eyes, clicked their rhythmic tongues, the brittle whistle of their mating dance, and echoes swaddled like a shawl over the bosom of the island. Tides churned. Fishermen stayed ashore, drinking arak under philao trees, watching the disquiet of the sea with blood and dread in their eyes. It was Zone Muffin. Everybody felt the ripple of agitation in their heart, prayed away the ill-omened day with bread, salt, and water. Kandimun, the elders, said it was the retelling of an old sentiment. Island bodies are haunted by the longings of spirits lost in the Kalapani. And because we are severed from the sacred river, we have forgotten the songs to soothe the torment of the ancestors. So on days like these, Zone Muffin, when they sail to us from the mud of the ocean, our bodies bruise and brood. My mother, a nurse, in the 10th lunar cycle of her pregnancy, working her day shift at the hospital, felt her rib cage outstretched like mangrove roots into the swelled waters of her belly. She heard the voice of her dead mother, thin like smoke in her right ear, and she knew the time had come. She breathed deeply, asked Durgama and La Vieille Noire to protect her, and filled out the paperwork to admit herself into hospital. An hour later, I breathed my first breath. The great-grand-aunt, who was the oldest member of the family, was immediately brought in to see me. A full set of hair, 2
eyes, 2 ears, 2 arms, 2 feet, a small flat nose, a belly button, and a penis. Il y a une jolie baba, il paraît une jolie baba, mais c'est mon guetté qui joue les nez. Un zoomofile. Qui peut faire si son coco piqué? Alket Swami demande qui peut faire pour bénir son enfant là?
My father woke up before sunrise the next morning. He shaved, showered, applied a smear of vibhuti on his forehead. He grabbed the platter of offerings he had prepared the night before: bananas, coconut, milk, rose water, saffron, marigolds, honey, camphor, gâteau coco, and he rushed to the Mariam Corville. He passed the peacocks, perched on mango trees, roosting in the precinct of the temple. He entered the courtyard, removed his sandals, rinsed his feet, circled the temple 3 times, breathed deeply, and finally stepped across the doorway as the first light of the day washed over the sculpted eyes of 1,001 gods. He bowed to each one of them, praying, 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 praying they'd protect me from the towers of muffin looming over my destiny. When he was done breaking coconuts, lighting sandalwood, dropping money in donation jars, praying, 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 praying so the pantheon would shed light onto the crevices of my kismet, he fell to his knees and exhaled, Ayo Swami, voice of knowledge, voice of wisdom, Mugosu ineye aziz dollar muffin. Is there anything we can do to bless the child? Swami looked at my father with luminous eyes striped with ash, compassion, and ceremony. He burned camphor on a copper platter, whirled it 6 times around the goddess, folded in pleats of red and yellow silk. Seated in her chariot of golden snakes, he placed a garland of 108 limes around her head, nestled under her crown of lotus petals. He snapped his fingers 3 times at her side, lodged blue hortensias between her ears and her shoulders. With Mariamman's blessing and an earthen lamp, Swami sat on the ground, opened his books and his charts, the entire cosmos with dots, lines, numbers, Sanskrit, spread with galaxies known and unknown in the shape of traveling stars, suns, and moons, fated and unfated. It was all written, my destiny. Tuesday, born at 2:45 p.m., born in Pamplemousse. Swami's thick fingers pelted like meteors over the swaths of charts, scores, figures. Veins of the universe silhouetted into Vedic chants, tabulated into equations, refigured into mantras that slipped from under his tongue as his eyes orbited 108 times over and around my destiny. Taking a deep breath, Swami bloated his belly like that of Ganapati. Ka! His name shall start with Ka and shall comprise only 2 syllables. My father knelt down, his hands folded in prayer, small and humble at the feet of Swami, voice of knowledge, voice of wisdom. He stooped his forehead to the ground, his body a platter of gratitude, his heart a single flower searching for light amongst a field of frangipanis. His lips, a never-ending breath touched by the grace of 1,001 gods. Prostrate, he looked up into the eyes of Mariamen. Ka. As he said it out loud for the very first time, my father's skin felt awash in a sea of vibrity. His hairs arose in whirls, milky, delicate, earthy, like an island of smoke soaring over a boundless primeval ocean. He looked deep into the eyes of Mariamen, and in her chiseled, penetrating gaze, he saw soft skin, curly hair, cold outline, playful eyes, a black puttu on a tender forehead, a vision of the daughter he had wished for, longed for. Time stood still, perched on the edges of his vision, ephemeral like wrinkled waves of lilac haze. My father chanted prayers in a language he could not even understand, but echoed purity in the temple of his soul. He trusted. His vision was good omen. A message from Mariamen he'd later have to decipher. Satisfied he had broken the shadow of muffin lurking over my destiny. He grabbed his platter of offerings, dropped more money in donation drawers, walked backwards towards the doorway of the temple, found his sandals, and made his way to the city of Portris, eager to name his newborn child. He held on to the car in his hands like a precious gift, a healing syllable, an occult melody, a miraculous remedy until he reached the civil status office. He got me a birth certificate without consulting anyone, not even my mother. He named me Ka Ma. For years after that, whenever I asked my parents how I got my name, no one told me that I was born on Zone Muffin. My father simply said he had read an article in Reader's Digest, where he learned that in Indian mythology, Kama is the god of love, a deity armed with a bow made of a sugarcane stalk, a bowstring made of a line of bees, and arrows tipped with 5 flowers. And he thought it was beautiful. He could never quite explain to me why the names of the men and the boys in the family are Surensen, Karlsen, Karisen, Kumaren, Krishnan, Valen, Krisen, Visen. And the names of the girls and the women in the family are Yumila, Shamila, Brinda, Yovana, Yanka, Vanessa, Priyanka, Sapna. And the name that became mine, Ka Ma. So that was one of the pieces, which is the opening piece from Zumfam. So a couple of things that I want to share with you before I read on the piece from this book is so just to give you a little bit about the history of how this book came about, because it wasn't supposed to be a book in the beginning. So basically the way this happened is that I was predominantly doing a lot of spoken word between 2013 to 2017-ish. I discovered spoken word mostly in the queer trans people of color scenes of Montreal, and totally fell in love with it. And it was also where, yeah, all the queer and trans people would hang out and like share their stories and bear witness to each other's stories. And that was just so impactful for me as a process. And I thought it was 2013 and I was like, I think I want to do spoken word. I think I want to like write stories and get on that stage and start sharing my stories as well. And that's when I wrote my very, very first spoken word piece. Actually, the birth piece that I just read to you, there's a very different version of this, but an earlier version of a story around my birth and my naming was the very first spoken word piece I wrote in 2013. And I performed that for the first time in 2013. But anyway, so then I ended up like, you know, I really loved spoken word. I love what you could do with the voice and the multiple forms of storytelling that, you know, could be modulated through the voice. And I really fell in love with the form. So throughout those years, I started like just writing separate pieces, normally, you know, 7 to 10 minutes pieces that I would perform at cabarets and spoken word nights and open mics and stuff like that. And it was only in 2016 I did a tour with my one woman spoken word show across Europe. And basically, really, I just wanted to go on tour. Like I was like, I just wanted to travel. I just wanted to go on tour. But what I had done then is I had just put a bunch of my pieces together. Like I just put a bunch of my repertoire together and I gave it a title and I went performing. And it's only when I came back from this tour that I realized it really felt almost like that the poetry was speaking back to me. And that's when I realized there was something else happening in those separate pieces that I was written. I realized there's a storyline that was developing and there was actually a story that I was trying to narrate. And I didn't know that this was what I was doing initially. Like I love those moments as an artist where it feels like your work speaks back to you. And for the first time you see the work in a new way and you think, oh, this is what I'm trying to do here. So then I started developing Zumfam and, you know, I started reworking each of the pieces, removing some pieces, writing new ones. And I started working on Zumfam, not as a book. I started working on Zumfam as a manuscript for the stage. Because one of the things that had happened by then for me as a multidisciplinary artist was I love spoken word. I love what it can do. I love when a voice tries to like summon an entire room and hold an entire room. I think there's something extremely powerful about that kind of poetry. But the more I was performing, the more I realized my body wanted to move. And it turns out that in a past life of mine, I lived in India when I was a young adult from between 2003 to 2008. And I was actually trained in Kathak, which is one of the Indian classical dances, and an Indian contemporary dance when I lived in India. But that was like many, many years ago. And I hadn't danced. It had been 10 years since I had been in Canada, and I had stopped dancing when I moved to Canada. So then I developed an obsession with the question. I really started thinking about like, what would poetry in movement look like? Like, what if the poetry could move through space and through the body, through rituals and dance? And what if it could take over my body beyond just taking over my voice? So that's when I started developing Zumfam as a show. I wrote like the manuscript for an interdisciplinary show, which was supposed to be presented. The show is mounted, it's fully produced. It was supposed to premiere at the Montréal Art Interculturel, which is a theater in Montreal in April 2020. So basically exactly a year ago, I was like in the full swing of production of this show. And then on March 12th, well, you know, we all know what happened on March 12th, which by the way is also Mauritius Independence Day is also on March 12th. So then the show got cancelled and then it was rescheduled for October. It was supposed to premiere in October in Montreal because things were going really well with the pandemic. And then in October, what became the red zone in Montreal hit us, the second wave hit us. And a week, like literally a week, I was in the theater mounting the show. A week before the show was supposed to open, the show got cancelled again, which is fine. I think grief is part of our creative processes, and I have faith in, you know, in the spirits out there. I have faith in the universe that when the world will be ready, the show is going to find her audiences and the audiences are going to find the show. And for now, there's the book. that's still there. And the one thing about the book that I also want to tell you about is, you know, so turning the manuscript from a stage piece into a book happened at a later point in the process. And that was also interesting for me, because just as much as when I was working on the show, I was thinking, how does poetry move through the body? What would that look like and feel like? When it came the time to turn the manuscript into a book, I really started thinking of the text as the body. So I really started thinking of this piece. I started asking myself, what does the body of the text look like if the body of the text is performing on the page? And that was very intentional for me. So for those of you who might have a copy of the book or have read the book, you will see that like everything, every single word, every single line is actually laid out like in very, very intentional ways in the book. And that was something for me that was actually very intentional, because I really wanted to reflect, to bring that performative, you know, like that performative aspect of this work onto the page, and also the visual arts aspect, because I'm also a visual artist in that sense. But I wanted the object to not just be a literary object, but also to feel like performance, but also to feel visually like a visual object. In terms of how we engage with the poetry. So that's a bit of the history behind this book. Okay, I'm also looking at the time. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to read one more piece, and then we can open it up to discussions. Actually, no, just because for the sake of time. Yeah, okay. I will read one more piece and then a very short piece. One of the pieces, so the piece that I'm going to read now is called Existence as Gender Survivance. And I'm specifically so the entire Zumfam is written in the first person narrative for all of it, but there are two pieces in it that are written in the second person narrative, and Existence as Gender Survivance is one of them. So I think I want to share this piece with you. So this is Existence as Gender Survivance from Zumfam. When you grew up, a queer femme child on a plantation island, there is a story scripted for your body. And this story, age 5, your body knows how to kick a ball. Age 9, your body knows not to want or need a hug. Age 12, your body knows how to mix concrete. Age 14, your body knows how to curse a woman if there isn't enough sugar in his tea. Age 15, your body puffs cigarettes with his friends at the bus station after school. Kumadia yen grand Marie. Age 17, your body drinks arak under the jackfruit tree at family gatherings. Age 20, your body becomes a man who acts like a boy, who acts like a man. In this story, your body forges an existence that dismisses pain, except for the nights when your body douses his trunk with arak lava burning through his core as your body roars and rages, shaking the foundations of the house your body tried so hard to build, breaking bones, bruising skin over the sound of your body's own screaming voice until your body pieces himself, cries to sleep like the little boy who acts like a man that he is. When you grow up, a queer femme child on a plantation island, you quickly learn the urgency of rehearsing existence as gender survivance. You unwrite the story scripted for your body. You learn to make yourself discreet enough, small enough, polite enough, so you get to be
the timid child, the helpful child, the studious child, the good child. Good because you're quiet. Good because you never speak. Good because you've learned to erase yourself, to disappear. You pocket small change, currencies of acceptance, drops of love that want you to quell the femme in you, and you slur, oui, moi un beaux enfant, oui, moi va faire mon muffin disparaître. You sculpt a soft masculinity. You dilute a brewing femininity. You smuggle desires into a clandestine body, smother prosody under your skin. You walk fine lines, embroidered borders, boundaries, etched interstices, archipelagos and dwellings hemmed into coastlines of being, longing and belonging. You trace an atlas of illusion. You carve spaces for your queerness to survive. You carve spaces so you can stay alive. You seek refuge in the silken pleats of your mother's saris, in the lyrical fulfillment of pictorial make-believe, in the wistful smell of crayons and wood shavings. You wrap yourself in domesticity, a blanket of safety. You make yourself small, molding your figure to fit in nooks between the fridge and the kitchen door, between the sink and the gas stove, spaces where you learn to slaughter a chicken, to gut a fish, to grind garlic, ginger, saffron, dried chilies, and curry leaves on a polished slab of black stone. It is in these spaces you learn to witness fun intimacies, storytelling, gossip, sisterhood, support, softness pointed and sharp like a cooking blade. It is in these spaces you learn the value of honoring. It is in these spaces you learn the virtue of worship. It is in these spaces you learn that resilience is not the silent bruise under your skin, but the hallowed space lodged inside your breastbone. When you grew up, a queer femme child on a plantation island, where boys are supposed to act like men who act like boys who act like men, you conceal your shame like sunset pollen, nested under the folds of rose petals. You dress like a pilgrim, footsteps on an ocean of burning coal, to prophesy re-belonging. You lay the foundations for new tongues, vocabularies, spaces, bodies of existence as gender survivance. So that was existence as gender survivance. And now I'm going to read a short excerpt to wrap up, and then we'll open it up to like the discussion and the questions. So one of the things that I do in Zumfam, in the piece that actually calls Zumfam. So Zumfam, just to give the context, Zumfam is a Creole term that means men, woman, but as one term. It's kind of the equivalent of like transgender, if you want, or trans femme. And it's a very important term to me because I think, you know, a lot of this book is actually offering an alternative narrative of trans understanding and trans history that goes against, you know, the dominant Western trans narrative, right? Like, which is that narrative
narrative of that medicalized and colonial narrative of being trapped in the wrong body and having to have a medical and a state intervention into that body to then rectify that journey, right? Like, which is the dominant colonial form of understanding trans identity, which is actually very new, and was actually but it has been, like, the gender binary itself has been a colonial tool in that sense. And this work is about honoring the multiple pre-colonial and decolonial ways in which gender identities outside of the binary have actually existed for thousands of years, right? Like in so many communities, in pre-colonial communities, and that also includes the indigenous communities of Turtle Island, right? Of what we now know as Canada. And I think, so a lot of the writing for me it was very important that the title of the book, even if this is a book predominantly written in English and published in Canada, that the title being Creole and be some femme, because that felt like important for me as a political act, actually, to decenter the colonial understandings and histories and notions of gender, including transgender and trans identities and trans ways of being. So one of the things that I do with Zumfam is a term in the story that was actually given to me by my mother, and then that's the narrative that unfolds in the piece called Zumfam. But one of the things that I do with this piece is that I actually create a trans ancestor, because I think, because I think one of the magical things that we actually have is that we have access to our imagination, and I think our past and our ancestors continue living in us, and I think the act of the imagination allows us to then reactivate that ancestry and rewrite, and give life to that ancestry. So I create this ancestor in this piece, and her name is Kumkum. She's the trans ancestor. So I just wanted to finish by introducing you to Kumkum, and then, yeah. So I'll introduce you to Kumkum. I dream of Kumkum with round shoulders, a blood-red bindi on her forehead, a glint of gold hanging over the edge of her pointed nose, raven curly hair, a tad too greasy, but that still bounces up and down the nape of her neck as she walks in the morning sun. Kumkum wears plain cotton kurtas that she handles in the markets of Prenvert. And if she ever gets invited to a wedding, she adorns herself of her most prized garment, a brocaded red salwar kameez that wraps her rotten body like the heavy skin of syrupy lychee. Kumkum eats rice, dal, and pickles during the week. And on weekends, she treats herself to some dried, salted fish cooked with onions, fresh thyme, and tomatoes. And bon chogaille poisson salé bien mauricien. Kumkum has a radio set, and she listens to the news and avis de décès every morning, and Hindi songs every evening. Kumkum rubs coconut oil in her fake black hair every Friday. Kumkum has a job. She works in the tobacco factory in the capital city with all the poor women whose husbands had died in obscure wars nobody on the island really knows about. They fought in a faraway British war and never came back. On her lunch break, Kumkum does not step out with the other women to roll tobacco in small newspaper pieces that burn their darkened lips. Instead, she stays at her workstation. She sits silently and she prays. She prays. She prays to Goddess Durkama. She prays for a safe life. She prays for forgiveness. She prays for love. When it gets hot in the capital city, Kumkum takes out a wide embroidered handkerchief from her purse and wipes the purse of sweat from her forehead. Kum likes flower patterns. She also loves embroidery. On Sundays, Kum polishes her floors against Coco. She brings out her mattress, leans it in the sun against the mango tree, and beats it with a stick. She winnows her rice and her lentils for the week. She makes fruit pickles that she dries on her roof, and at the end of the day, she massages her feet with a slick of warm coconut oil. Kum has a lover. But does Kum have a lover? I'm not sure yet whether Kum has a lover or not, but this is Kum. This is Kum, and I dream about her every day. She draws her life like a moving sculpture, a figure ever so ephemeral, becoming and unbecoming herself with every single one of my dreams. So that was Kum. I think that's it for now in terms of reading. So all of this was from Zumfam, published at Metonymy Press, which you can order online or you can order from any of your local Canadian, North American bookstores. It's also available in the UK if you're joining from, and Europe if you're joining from there. So yes, and thank you everybody for bearing witness and having me, and welcome back, Rolesh.
Karma, thank you so much for sharing with us this beautiful, beautiful work. It's so wonderful to have seen you engage in performance and reading. I'm going to begin by just asking a couple of questions. And also, if anyone would like to ask Karma a question, you could type in your question in the Q&A section of the Zoom webinar, and I would read it to Karma. But let's begin with, you touched a little bit on this question, but I'd like to repose it in a different way. Can you tell us a little bit more of how this project came into being? And also, if you could reflect a little on how the COVID-19 pandemic has affected your work and your performances, and how it has allowed you to reimagine the work and to also shift the work in new directions.
I think I will. I mean, I've talked about the process itself in terms of like the process of how that. So, but I think the part that I will talk about, I love that question of like, how did the work come into being? Because I think the other part of it then is like the stories that get told, right? Like there's the process, and then there's actually the stories that get told through this work. And I think in terms of that, I think it really felt to me like a birthing. Like it really felt like I birthed this work. And I think a lot about, like, particularly for us as marginalized artists, as queer trans people of color, how in many ways we need to birth our narratives into the world, right? Like how in many ways we, for me, it's interesting because in a Mauritian context, this is like, you know, like this is actually the first like queer Mauritian work that's actually out there, which is why I'm in Mauritius right now, trying to like launch the book here and make it available here. And I think there's always that search, right? There was always that search for like your history. And because of the way in which, like, you know, the patriarchy and colonial history intersect, there's historically, like, I think a lot of like, you know, like those queer histories of the Kalapani, for example, and that was part of the reflection for me in terms of like having this work come into being. I think there was a lot for me about birthing those parts of myself on the one hand, and then on the other hand, birthing those histories that I felt needed to be told. And yeah, so there was that, and the other part of it, you know, and in many ways it was like a very personal thing. Like I'm like, I think the work started in a very self-centered way. Those were stories that I needed, you know, like when I started this, I wasn't thinking of like, oh, the other kids out there need this, or like, you know, the kin out there, you know, I was really thinking of like, I need this and I need to write it and put this work out there. And I think when it comes to the part of like COVID impacting the work, I think more than anything for me, because it's now I do speak of this work, for me, this is actually deeply spiritual work. Like increasingly, the more it came together, the more I realized this, especially when it came to the show. By the time the show was ready, like I swear we were like in the technical residency, and it really felt to me that I wasn't even performing, that my body was just a vessel, you know, and I was just channeling voices that are not mine. And for me, there's something so fundamentally, like, because my artistic work is spiritual work, and there's something so fundamental to that. Like I believe in that sort of like spiritual creative process, and I do believe that for me as a writer, as an artist, I, you know, like the goal is that at a point of time in my career, if I'm not writing my work anymore, but that my voice and my body is just a vessel where other voices come through me, like that's for me, that's where I want to go. But to connect this to the pandemic and COVID-19, I think what the pandemic and the cancellation of the show, right? Like a year ago, the show gets canceled. It's the, you know, like it's the beginning of the pandemic. Nobody knows what's going to happen. We're locked up for like 4 months in our homes in Montreal. And I think more than anything, what it did for me is that it deepened my spirituality and my spiritual practice. Right. And my understanding of this work as being spiritual. You know what I said earlier, where I'm like, I have absolute faith that the show is going to happen someday. Right. And I think for me, it's just a question of the world's going to be ready for it, you know, and the work is going to be ready to meet the world. And I think more than anything for me, like what everything around the pandemic did for me was more than anything, made me realize that grief is part of the process. Right. You know, like and that's also part of the spiritual process. There's a deep part of grief, because I had grieved this project, and then it came back months later, right. And it came back in way more powerful ways. So I would say those were the lessons for me.
Yes, that's so wonderful to hear. I think I'll ask one more question and then we will go to the chat, right? Because I want to also give the students also a voice. So throughout the text, you connect your own migrations, movements, and oceanic crossings to those of your ancestors, especially as it shapes, informs, and morphs how we understand gender and sexuality. So there's a deep resonance across time and space. It almost becomes a metaphor to think through the kinds of crossings across all kinds of categories, right? Designed to strategically order human life, right? The colonial ways of being, like crossings across racial categories, gender crossings. And what's so interesting is how these crossings direct us to local and indigenous formations and articulations of gender, for instance, like Zom Fam. And on page 89 of the text, and I just want to go to this because I think it also helps in terms of the class and the students, and I think that may also bring them in a little bit. In Zomfam, you write on page 89 that Zomfam means man, woman. And you write, I take pleasure in being Zomfam, a man, woman being neither Zom nor Fam, yet being both Zom and Fam. And one of the things that stuck out to me the multiple times I read this and was drawn to this passage was the use of the word pleasure. And I'm wondering if you can reflect on this and your use of the word pleasure here. And here I'm also thinking about the relationship between pleasure and desire. And if I may, I want to bring something else in. I've also been reading Madhavi Menon's A History of Desire in India, right? And very early on, she establishes that Kama is the Hindu god of romantic and sexual desire. So I'm just going to leave it there and respond any way you want.
Yeah, thank you. Hold on, I'm just making a note.
There's something about pleasure, like reading the text itself is a form of pleasure, but there's something about pleasure that resonates throughout the text and throughout the long poems.
Yeah, that was okay. I will answer this question in a second, but I will just read just a few lines. I will reread that section right now. So she calls me Zamfam, which in our local language means man, woman. I take pleasure in being Zamfam, a man-woman being neither homme nor femme, yet being both homme and femme, navigating a middle passage between being and becoming, an interstice where migrant bodies like mine find their truth, an undefinable space that maps the cartography of my skin, a hyphen that holds and wraps my gendered experience.
Beautiful.
There's this line, and also there's also on the last page there's also the line, I travel across oceans, I travel across genders, which is also one of my favorite lines. So anyway, so I wanted to reread that, and yes, I think there's a lot to it. I have to say, one of the things that surprised me when the book came out, and actually it was actually before the book came out, like advanced reviewers were starting to read the book. And one of the things that people started commenting on a lot was actually the joy in the book.
Right.
And that was, you know, like sometimes I get that question where people ask me like, what is one thing that surprised you since your book came out? And that's typically the answer that I gave. I didn't realize how much of the joy would be translated.
Right.
And that part is actually so important to me. Like, it's so, you know, like that sort of like, because there's something, I feel particularly like, you know, so much of our histories, so much of the narrative, which are typically like, you know, white supremacist, colonial, you know, like patriarchal narratives that are put onto us around suffering, right? Like so much, like it's like normally that's it. Like when you go like, hey, I'm trans, people are like, show me your wounds, you know, like that's the first thing people want to say, you know, like show me the wounds, like tell me about all your scars, like and that happens so many times. Even when you talk to journalists, right? Like the first question they ask you is like, tell me about how hard your childhood was.
Right.
You're right. Like that's the first thing they want to go to. And I think for me there is that part, like I love poetry. Like that's the one thing I think, the part that, because I had so much pleasure really writing those pieces. Like for me, the editing this book was like amazing. Like I had such a blast, in the sense of like it had been so many years in the making, and I felt and I really honor now, like all the years, like, you know, that this was 5 years in the making, because I think it allowed me to keep refining and being more connected to my own intuition, to my own spirit. So then when I found, I was so connected to my intuition that when every word, every single thing, like literally, I'm just like, every single word in this was like made from a place of joy. And I knew that for myself, but I did not know that this would come across when people would read it. So that was like one of the big surprises for me. And I think it's important. And I think the other part of it then, to connect it more to that question of gender and desire, if you wish, is also, you know, like I think a lot of like the spiritual role that as gender non-conforming people, as trans people, whatever word you want to use here, as homme femme, that we bring into the world, right? Like that goes against that narrative, that Western narrative, right? Like I work a lot with youth, right? Like, and that's one of the things that I always tell my youth. I'm like, we travel across genders. Is there anything more? Is there anything more magical than this in the world, right? Like, is there anything more magical? And I always say this. I'm like, it's important for us to remember our magic and what is magical in us. And for me, there's also pleasure in that magic, right? Like there's also a form of spiritual and human empowerment. And I think that's the question of pleasure. Even if I don't like explicitly in many ways that delve into it, I love that it comes across when people read the work. Like I love that people find joy in it, because there's that also in the work. And I had tremendous joy, whether it's the book or the show. I had tremendous joy and pleasure working on it. So I'm glad that comes across.
I really like the way you translate the notion of the sacred as it relates to gender nonconformity and the movement. Like when you say there's nothing more, it's actually, there's nothing more better than traveling across genders. There's nothing more sacred about it. It's beautiful. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go to the chat so we have some time to take some questions. So the first question is by Richelle Nelson. Hi, Richelle. Thanks for joining us. As a creator, I personally find it particularly hard to tell parts of my story because of fear. So my question is, how did you find your voice through your art? What was your process to making a large part of your identity a work of art for people to consume?
Ooh, love this question. Thank you.
Yes, that's a good one.
Wishel, I hope I'm pronouncing this right. Thank you for this question. That's a really beautiful question, and I love that you brought fear. We were just talking about joy, and I love that like you brought fear into the conversation.
Yes.
I you know I think it's very important for us. It's challenging to but to actually step into our fears and to actually make friends with our fears. I think, I mean, because I've heard this so many times, like typically when you ask for anybody, any writer for creative writing advice, like everybody just tells you, write the thing that you're scared of, write the thing that
Right.
scares you. Yeah, and it's true. I hear this so many times. And I didn't quite get it until recently. I had a piece that was published in Carte Blanche, which is like online, called Talk Walking the Dark Road, where that was the first time for me where I was like, it really felt for this part. But beyond that notion of like, I think it's important to go beyond that notion of like stepping into your fear. Because for me, the way I understand it is like the stepping into your fear is actually listening to that story in you that is the most difficult to tell, right? Like, and because a lot of times people just say step into your fear. I'm like, well, what does that mean, right?
Yeah,
Like, and
yeah.
I think what it takes is that first of all, it's a process.
Right.
And it's important to honor that process. Like, you're not going to wake up tomorrow morning and go like, hey, I'm going to make friends with my fears. I think it's a process, and it's important to give yourself time and space to step into that. I think it's important for you to do it for yourself. Because part of your question was like, how do you then deal with other people? I'm like, don't think of others. Don't think of the narrative of others. Don't think of what others are expecting of you first. Like, you can do that process and not ever publish it, right? Like, do it for yourself, particularly as marginalized people. Like, like how are you going to navigate like how basically what is said in the question, how other people consume your art. So remove the consumption of the narrative first. Like, do it for yourself as something that you're doing in a relationship with yourself. If it ever comes to sharing, share it with your close people first. Share it with people that you trust. Share it with people who can hold your fears as well, right? Like with whom you have that kind of trust. And I would say the other part for me, and that is personally for me, the part of like stepping into your fear is also for me grounding myself in, for me at least, it's grounding myself in spirituality. Like, what are the ways in which when you're stepping into that fear, you don't have to do it alone? Can you call upon the ancestors? If you believe in a particular deity, in a particular god, can you call upon that deity or that god and say, I'm going to write this piece for the next 30 minutes. Be by my side. If you believe in spirit guides, if you believe in angels, like, it doesn't matter. But like, do you know that there's also other forces and other spiritual forces that you can draw on in that moment? Because you're not alone when you're stepping into that fear. You're not alone. You can draw from other forces.
Yes. I think that's so important, because I remember like when I started making artwork, it was always about making it for myself and going on that journey and engaging the kind of like different aesthetic forms as a practice of like doing something for the self first before you even think about putting it out into the world. And having that community, whether it's other friends or the spiritual community to guide you, is so essential to the kind of work that you are doing also. So the next question is by Wajiha. You make a lot of connections to your life and queerness to the region, including the plantation island, water, home, and more. Can you talk more about your connection to your growing up Zom fam, to the land, and to the importance of these connections?
Thank you. Thank you so much for this question as well, Wajiha. Yeah, I think there was, I think one of the, I think a lot of it for me in terms of writing this work. Like, you know, because the thing is, like, I left Mauritius when I was 18, 19. I got a first scholarship to leave, which was great. I was like, out of my parents' house, out of the country, yay, you know, because I was here, you know, and I went to India, and then I spent 5 years in India, and then I moved to Canada. And I think for the longest time, I tried to keep Mauritius at arm's length. Like, I had such a complex relationship to home. And, you know, there's that line in your body is the ocean, that says, I'm going to read it out for you, because you know, it says something like, you know, no matter the borders, fences, walls, masses of land, bodies of water you put between you and your home, you and your island, you and your body, the pain is something that you just can't leave behind, right? Like, you will drag its festering weight halfway across the globe in a heavy, invisible suitcase. So there's this line, and I think that's kind of like, I feel like what happened for me. Like, I tried to run away from anything Mauritius related, but actually it was living in me all this time. Right, like, and at a point of time, it basically caught up with me, and and it was a moment of reckoning. I had, you know, when that happened, and that's when I started writing and creating work about Mauritius. And a lot of it then for me felt like a rewriting of my queerness, right? Like a reclaiming of the island, a bringing back of the queer body, of the trans body, of the femme body onto the space of the island, where my entire life I had to erase all those parts of me, right? Like, I didn't allow them to come to life. So in that, for me, in that diasporic transnational trajectory, there was a return to home. And then there was the question of then, how do I write that trans, femme, queer body onto the island? And I think, again, then for me, you know, because I was also writing the ancestors in it, and I think spirituality became increasingly important. And I became very interested then in terms of what is the spiritual relationship between the body and the land, specifically between the queer femme body and the land. So that's how then I explore those multiple elements of the island, the water, the ocean. Like, I try to then draw like a spiritual relationship that connects them. And for me, that was my way of reclaiming Mauritius, reclaiming even the landscapes. And rewriting those connections, which is also, side note, very much one of the reasons why I'm here in Mauritius, is because I'm developing a new project called Queering the Island Body. And Queering the Island Body is very much, look, it's a visual arts installation project, and it's very much looking at that relationship. Like, what is the spiritual relationship between the queer body and the land? Like, what happens in that space between body and land? So I'm also very much thinking about this at the moment.
Lovely. So we do have another question by an anonymous attendee. Thank you so much for this gorgeous reading. As a queer brown boy, I was absolutely touched by this wonderful work. Your discussion of making yourself smaller to be a good child resonated so much with me. I was wondering if you could tell us more about when and how you learned to stop making yourself small. How did you learn to embrace your full self? What were the first steps you took?
Thank you, whomever wrote this question, anonymous attendee. That's also a beautiful, beautiful question.
Yes.
You know, at a point of time, I mean, in terms of my own experience, I think there's a lot tied to it. I think, you know, as I had mentioned earlier, there was just like being 18, 19, getting a full scholarship, getting to leave the country, leave my parents' home. And then suddenly I was in India, right? Unlike Mauritius, where everybody knows everybody and gossip goes around.
Right.
Suddenly I'm in India and I can do whatever I want, right? Like, sort of a thing. But independent of that, I think, you know, at a point of time, you gotta choose joy, right? Like, because at a point of time, there is that calling in you, there is that voice in you that actually wants to take up more space.
Right.
And for sure, particularly as kids, right? Like, because of power dynamics that exist between children and adults, right? Like, you end up repressing those parts of you, and you end up like repressing all those things that society needs to tell you to repress. But fundamentally, you know, it does make us unhappy. And I think that calling, that voice inside us continues living, right? Like, and And I think, again, it's like stepping into your fears. I think it's a process. Of course, I encourage you to honor all the parts of you. You know, you can do that in multiple ways. You can go to like workshops. You can start meditating. Whatever it is, you can write a love letter to that voice in you, right? That child in you that is so small. Write a love letter every morning, you know, like write something like, and when I say a love letter, like write five lines to that child every morning, right? Like, and start nurturing. Like, it's one of the things for me in terms of Zoom Farm that I think about a lot. I'm like, what this book did for me is that it nurtured the child who still lives in me, because that child is still there, still lives in me. And what this book did is that it nurtured and healed that child to a certain extent. And find your people, find the people with whom you could safely, you know, I'm assuming whoever wrote this is in Toronto. There's a lot of like queer brown networks and circles in Toronto, like, you know, like even depending on your identity, there's like queer Muslim circles, there's like, you know, there's like, so find your people, because, you know, if historically your family context and your cultural context has made you erase those parts of you, know that you're not alone, that there are actually a lot of other people out there who actually have come into themselves and are creating spaces for other people to come into themselves. So also find your people, find that safety, and slowly start nurturing that child. You know, it's like start allowing that child to grow in you, and it's a process, right? Like, but start nurturing that.
Lovely. So we do have one more question by Richelle also. You mentioned grieving your work and then coming back to it and finding more power from it. Did you learn anything new about yourself whilst going through this process and creating this project?
Ooh, oh my God, these questions are so good. I love it when I'm like in a discussion where I'm just like, whoa, all of these such good questions. Yeah, thank you, Richard, for this one. Absolutely. I think there was something so transformative about allowing grief to move through me. I think for me, that was one of the major lessons of the pandemic. And I've been thinking a lot of, you know, what had happened for me when the pandemic hit and we were under lockdown in Montreal. One of the things, and I live alone, and I have a lot of plants. Like, I have a lot of plants. I'm like this plant lady person. And I don't have pets or anything, but I have a lot of plants. And there was something for me about having my most intimate relationship with my plants in that sense, because suddenly, I mean, I always have a deep relationship with my plants. They all stay alive and are thriving mostly, right? Like, but during the pandemic, it's like that's all you're seeing, right? You're stuck in your apartment. And one of the things for me, I felt that I learned a lot was just like, I remember those multiple moments where I would just like watch a leaf die, you know, and then fall off. And then how another twig would come out from that, right? Like, how another leaf would go. And I was thinking a lot about, like, I think a lot of that imagery from that nature imagery of how, you know, a branch needs to die for another one to emerge. You know, or one of the images that I love also is like that a seed needs to break first, right? Like the seed breaks and then the root emerges. And those were really powerful images for me. So when I got there, I was like, I could hold on to this project, or I could just like let the sadness move through me. Because, you know, because when I started 2020, I was like so smug. I was like, this is my year. I have my show coming out. I have my book coming out. I was running like a national theater program that was supposed to happen in Toronto in the summer. Like, all of it got canceled, right? And then I was like, what do I do in this moment? And for me, I was like, what is the universe trying to teach me? And I think the first thing the universe is trying to teach me is to grieve. And I think when you grieve, it's like shedding a skin. So there's something else that emerges. And for me, that was like absolutely transformative. I just trusted it. I was like, I'm just going to be in the sadness. I'm just going to let go of those projects. And I just trusted it. And then a few months later, how it felt was like I was so much more spiritually connected. Like, it really felt like there was a new me emerging in the world. And I think that's it. I feel like, I've learned so much from me, but also so much from the universe, so to speak.
Thank you, Karma. Let's just pause for a minute. If anyone wants to ask any last questions, we do have a couple more minutes. This has been such a rich discussion. I don't want to overload it with too many questions, but I think we do have time for one more question from the audience. If there's something you are urgently wanting us to talk about, karma to reflect on, you could type it in now. And if not, we will extend our thanks to you for joining us all the way from Mauritius. And I'm sure it's quite late in Mauritius.
Yeah.
And for this beautiful performance and reading, and also I think I want to thank you for sharing this work with us.
Thank you.
Because it's through this act of sharing that we can create and imagine these different worlds that we also urgently desire, actually.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I've popped my website and my social media handles into the chat, so I think you should all see this. I'm on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. So if you want to like keep following the work and supporting the work, thank you so much, everybody, for being here today and bearing witness. And thank you, Jordash and the Women and Gender Studies Institute at the U of T. For this invitation. Really, what a delightful way for me to spend my Tuesday evening, my Tuesday night.
Yes. Okay, thank you everyone for attending. I really appreciate that you've taken time off your busy schedules, and I know that Zoom fatigue is real. And yeah, but thank you for attending and for being present and for engaging this beautiful work that is definitely going to change a lot of how we think about sexuality, region, race, migration, and multiple more keywords that I can throw out there. Okay. So do we